All right, hello, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we focus on impactful theories, explosive discoveries, and other things that you probably should know but don't because they've been suppressed. And today is Bible Decode 257, and we've been focused on the suppressed Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was written by the Roman Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. That is, Emperor Vespasian, his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. And they wrote the story of the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 years, back into the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s AD. At the same time, they wrote this as a psychological operation against the Jews, who they had just finished annihilating in a war called War of the Jews, from 66 to 73 AD. Both Vespasian and Titus were generals in that war and were both wounded in that war, and both were aware of the long history of enmity and disgust that the Romans had for the Jews, because the Jews would not obey under the Roman rule. The Jews had all of these quirky laws and this fickle and jealous and zealous God that they had to please, and they would do so on pain of death. And the Caesars the Romans just didn't really need that kind of high maintenance within their empire, where they had so many different nations to deal with. The Jews were the most difficult. And so they took advantage of the fact that the Jews were literally waiting for a Messiah to come. That would be a military hero that would help them throw out the Romans. And so the Romans themselves, the Flavians, wrote a story about a Jewish Messiah who instead was a Prince of Peace, and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, pointing out that the Roman slave owner centurion had the greatest faith in all of Israel, and turning the other cheek on oppression, at the same time as he goes outside the Jewish temple and overturns the tables of the money changers and castigates the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice in the Jewish temple. Also encouraging his Jewish disciples to abandon their families. And so Jesus is attacking the Jewish institutions, the traditions and the rituals, and at the same time, Jesus is totally deferential to Rome. And then when we go further in the book, into the epistles of Paul, we discover that Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus was, and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. And so this is somewhat of an anomaly. You could probably call that a red flag, and at least begin to hypothesize that maybe the Romans did have something to do with this, given that quia bono, who benefits from this? Really what the Romans wanted to do is they wanted to tame the Jews, or to domesticate the Jews, to prune the Jews, and even to graft themselves onto the legacy of the Jews, which they do. Now, in order to really grasp the material evidence here, you need to have your Gospels, but you also need to have a companion book that was written by the Flavians called Jewish War, or War of the Jews, about a history in 7 volumes of the war between the Romans and the Jews, and Titus and Vespasian are somewhat the protagonists in the book. And the book went out under the author name of Josephus, or Josephus. And, Christians know Josephus as the, first literary figure, first writer who actually corroborates the existence of Jesus. But when you recognize him as being just an agent of the Flavians, who themselves were working on this psychological operation against the Jews, then that no longer holds any water. And it turns out that all of the early writers who corroborated the existence of Jesus are members of the Roman royal families. That includes Emperor Trajan, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, and Tacitus. Now, some people kind of go halfway on the Roman origins hypothesis. If you want to see more evidence, what you do is you look at Josephus and you look for parallels between Josephus and the Gospels. Michael Menescot's found in the book of Luke, over 250 such parallels. Some of them are very thickly descripted, with just like 7, 8, 10 motifs that are in common just in the same passage, and incredibly well hidden, so that if you're just reading over it and you're not really looking, you won't see it. But if you're looking, it becomes very obvious. Some of them are obvious enough to notice without even looking for, and then some of them could be dismissed as coincidences, except for the fact that Menescot's also, in his book Christianity's Origin as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, which just came out last year, he graphs all of the 250 plus parallels on a chart, plotting a point at each location using Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. It forms 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, APTVS. Titus and Vespasian would be the TV. And there are some other, certainly, hypotheses for what the other letters are. The main point is that the Flavians themselves put their initials on the book of Luke. Also, the ministry of Jesus in Judea is nothing but a replica of the military campaign of Titus in Judea. Every place that Jesus goes, Titus goes, or vice versa. And at each location, they go to each location in the same order. They encounter a parallel event at each location, and each event, the events are spread out by exactly 40 years, or separated by exactly 40 years. And we're talking about over 40 events, separate events that are all like in the same order in the same book, in both books. Now we're looking at some other authors who've kind of skirted the Roman origins hypothesis. They probably weren't aware of it, and they definitely smell a rat in the New Testament, particularly with Paul. We went through just recently the book Operation Messiah by Voskelin and Sheldon, and they probed the idea that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans. Right now we're about to start a chapter from Robert Eisenman's book. This is an excerpt or a book of a couple of his books and some of his articles. That's called The Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians. And here he is arguing that Paul is not an agent of the Romans, an intelligence agent of the Romans, although I suppose he could be as well, but that Paul is a member of the Herod family. And now remember, Herod the Great was just the first Herod. His father was named Antipater. And there were a few dozen other Herods that ruled smaller provinces and principalities in the Roman Empire. So the Herods were really a family of puppet kings of the Romans. They were said to have been Idumeans, that's south of Judea. But there's some convincing argument that could be made that they were Hasmoneans as well, or maybe exclusively. And the Hasmoneans were also known as the Maccabees, the kind of ruling dynasty of Judea in the late 2nd, early 1st century BC. And they had basically overthrown the Seleucid Greek-Syrian dynasty that had gone in there kind of as a remnant of some of Alexander the Great's generals. But the Maccabees overthrew them and ruled for over 100 years there. And that Paul, maybe it was from that family, but Eisenman here is arguing that he is Herod, which the Herods maybe were Maccabeans also. So we'll see where Eisenman goes here. He is really up on the sources. He was one of the earliest people in the kind of modern era to get his chops on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he also borrows heavily from a lot of the pseudo-Clementine literature and the Talmud. And so, you know, Eisenman, I think, is really good for just his breadth of scholarship. Like he's looked at all of it. And, you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls posits a teacher of righteousness, a wicked priest, and a liar. Those are kind of the three archetypal characters that are discussed in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were not discovered until the 20th century, but most historians now date them from the 1st century AD. All those others dated a little bit earlier. They were like very pious Jewish, almost monks that lived at Qumran, about 20 miles from Jerusalem on the Dead Sea, and they deposited all their writings, most of which were just copies of books of the Old Testament, or that eventually became the Old Testament. But there is a lot of also sectarian material, you know, things that are specific to the sect of the people that were living there. And a lot of authors have tried to connect the stories in the Dead Sea Scrolls with the early Christian literature, the Gospels and the epistles. and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, it seems like. But the question is, who is the teacher of righteousness? And Eisenman thinks it's James, the brother of Jesus. Barbara Thiering thinks it's John the Baptist. A lot of people think it's Jesus. And, so on. So this should be an interesting excursion here. It's called Paul as Herodian. There are materials in the New Testament, early church literature, rabbinic literature, and in Josephus, which point to some connection between Paul and Herodians, such as Matthew 22:16. These materials provide valuable insight into problems related to Paul's origins, his Roman citizenship, the power he conspicuously wields in Jerusalem when only a comparatively young man, and the Herodian thrust of some of his doctrines, and as a consequence, those of the New Testament, envisioning a community in which both Greeks and Jews would enjoy equal promises and privileges. Now, when he says Greeks, I believe he also means Romans. I think the word is kittim. That's probably the Greek word, kittim, meaning kind of just like Gentile. So I think it encompasses both Greeks and Romans. Okay, by Herodian, we mean a religio-political orientation not inimical to the aims of the Herodian family as a whole, not only in Palestine, but also in Asia Minor and even Rome, possibly even implying a genealogical connection as well. Examples of the effect of such an orientation expressed with retrospective historical effect in the Gospels would include the curious thematic repetitions portraying a Jewish Messiah desiring table fellowship with, quote, sinners, publicans, and prostitutes. He has a lot of stuff in parentheses here, so I'm opting to leave it out just for clarity's sake. In addition to these would be a whole genre of other allusions, such as the first shall be last, these little ones or simple ones, the Messiah as wine bibber, presumably therefore distinguished from such well-known lifelong Nazarite types as Jesus' brother James, John the Baptist, the wilderness teacher who wore only clothing of vegetable origin and bathed regularly in cold water that Josephus calls Banus, and probably the righteous teacher at Qumran. So he uses a lot of these just like little quotes, 2-3 word summations that are common to several different texts that he's going over. And he's looking at all of the different kind of ascetic types of religious ascetics, which he groups as Jesus' brother James, John the Baptist, and this Banus character, who is a character in Josephus or Josephus's War of the Jews, who was one of Josephus's mentors, and he was a lot like John the Baptist, no doubt, because he had this, I don't know, it didn't say he lived off a diet of honey and locusts, but it was something like that. It was something on that same level. Okay. In recent work, I have not only argued for the precedence literary and historical evidence must take over archaeological and paleographic evidence of the kind which exists for Qumran. But I've also attempted to concretize the basic political and, by consequence, religious orientation of Qumran as anti-Herodian. The last allows us to arrive at a proper textual and historical dating of Qumran documents and has important ramifications for gospel research. Underestimating it, I believe, is one of the most serious defects of Qumran research. I have also redefined Pharisees generically in terms of seeking accommodation with foreigners. The reasons for this were twofold. First, to take into account important self-professed Pharisees like Paul and Josephus. And second, to relate such persons and others to the well-known Qumran circumlocution, the seekers after smooth things, found in documents like the Nahum Pesher and the Damascus document. Now, these Peshers are kind of expounding on the text using a lot of the Old Testament. I mean, Nahum is one of the Old Testament books, but the Pesher is like it's kind of like a code, but you're using other texts to kind of encode certain things that you can bring out to somebody who knows. You have to really know the literature, because it will refer to references that will answer the questions that you're asking, but you have to know where to look to find it. That was not a good explanation. I'm going to try to get a better explanation of the Pesher technique. By this, I mean that we should not simply call Pharisees those whom the Talmud or Josephus might so identify, but those so identifiable because of an accommodating attitude towards foreign rule generally, and some of its important ramifications like acceptance of gifts or sacrifices on behalf of foreigners in the temple, Herodian or foreign appointment of high priests, etc. Now, it seems to me like the Sadducees are even more like that. The Sadducees are even more accommodating toward foreign rule generally. So, you might as well just even get rid of the term. And then you have, on the other hand, the Zealots or the Qumran crowd. Okay, this is something of a new way of looking at Pharisees, who in Jewish tradition have generally always been looked upon as the heroic saviors of the Jewish people. Taken within parameters such as these, however, they look very much like collaborators, and this would have been very much how they were regarded by their more extremist zealot opponents. In several documents and contexts, Qumran presents a basic alliance or modus vivendi between groups it variously refers to as the traders, the congregation of traders, the seekers after smooth things, the man of lying, the comedian, the pourer out of lying, the violent ones of the Gentiles, the men of war, the house of Ephraim, etc. The last allusion, which is found in the Nahum Pesher, in the context of various problems relating to the period in which the seekers after smooth things held sway in Jerusalem, is also linked to a lying tongue who leads many astray, including a group denoted as the simple ones of Ephraim. Problems with overseas messengers and allusion to the city of blood, which in the Habakkuk Pesher relates to ideological problems with the liar, and through the use of the expression nilvu, meaning joining, an expression in Esdras 9:27 applies to non-Jews attaching themselves in some manner to the Jewish community, is also linked to Gentiles. It also contrasts with other expressions found, for instance, in documents such as the Habakkuk Pesher, like the simple ones of Judah doing Torah doers in the house of Judah, the poor, or Ebianim, the meek, and the downtrodden, and the many, on behalf of whom the teacher of righteousness carries out his proper justifying activity of making many righteous, as opposed to lying, leading many astray, and wearing out the many with a worthless service for the sake of his glory, and works that count for nothing. In my book, previous book, which we will probably read in its entirety here coming up, it's called Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, I identified at least those indicated under the circumlocution violent ones of the Gentiles, with renegade Herodian men of war, some of whom at first support the uprising and then desert it. These are said in another Pesher from Qumran, that on Psalm 37, a Zodic text like Habakkuk 1:4 and 2:4, to have taken vengeance on the wicked priest for what he did to the righteous teacher. They can also perhaps be partly identifiable with those Josephus calls Idumeans, who are at first the allies of those he starts to call at this point zealots, and support the uprising, then desert it. Along with John the Essene, these violent Gentiles are among the revolution's bravest military commanders in the early days, and would appear to take their war policy even further than zealots or Sicarii. Among these, I would include Queen Helen's kinsmen Monobazus and Kenedakos, who were killed in the attack on the Roman reinforcements at the pass at Beit Horon, Niger of Perea across the Jordan, a leader of Josephus's Idumeans, who ultimately died a death at the hands of the Zealots, suspiciously similar to that predicated of Jesus in Scripture. Silas, also close to the Herodian family, possibly brought up with Agrippa I, and who is another Herod, and in the final analysis, a deserter from Agrippa II's army, and perhaps even Philip, son of Jasimus, the strategos, or head of Agrippa II's bodyguard in Caesarea. At the same time, some of these last were probably on intimate terms with the person Josephus calls Saulus, a kinsman of Agrippa. This Saulus was probably the descendant of the Idumean Castobarus, the husband of Herod's sister Salome, and the real Idumean in Herodian genealogies. So is the other side Maccabean? It's Herod's sister. Well, why is she an Idumean and Herod isn't? I don't get that. Not the first thing I haven't gotten, by the way, but get what you can. His descendant Saulus, some 2 generations later, was a principal member of the pro-Roman peace coalition, and the go-between in 66 AD before he was sent to Corinth on a mission to Nero for Agrippa II and all those desirous for peace. This is the alliance which actually invites the Romans camped outside the city to send their soldiers into Jerusalem to suppress the revolt. So this character's name is Saulus. But it's after the time that Paul is said to have been, put to death. Okay. Paul's basic attempts to found a community where both Greeks and Hebrews, or as he puts it, sometimes Jews first, but Greeks as well, enjoy equal promises and privileges, spiritual or otherwise, and consonant soteriological equity are well documented, such as Romans 3:22 and 1 Corinthians 12:13. This cosmopolitanism is based on a more easygoing attitude toward the law, as opposed to Qumran's and James's strict constructionist, not one jot or tittle approach, the ideal of justification by faith alone, as opposed to, for instance, the Habakkuk Pesher 8's insistence upon doing the Torah as a prerequisite for justification, and an open hostility to circumcision, which undoubtedly found a sympathetic response from such Asian rulers as Antiochus of Commagene and Monobasis' mother, Helen of Ediabene, further cast. Azizus of Emesa, modern Hams in Syria, who married Drusilla after he had specifically agreed to circumcise himself only to have her divorce him, and Polemo of Cilicia, whom Berenike divorced after he too had himself circumcised, which Josephus tells us that he did on account of her great riches. It also included an easygoing approach to dietary matters, as opposed to the strict kosher laws. I think we're out of time here. Just want to mention that he's using Josephus a lot here for evidence, and I think the Roman origin hypothesis really points out that Josephus is not reliable, because he's in on it with this psyop that they're doing with the New Testament.